Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. And on this month's episode, we're discussing TID's history and how the district entered the electric business. For 100 years, TID has served safe, reliable, and affordable power to our community, which is still vital to our region's well-being today. But getting to that point was no easy task. It took visionaries, legal battles, monumental decisions, and votes to bring what we know as TID to fruition. On this episode, I welcome back author and historian Dr. Paterson to discuss the district's struggles in the early 20th century, the construction of Old Don Pedro, and how TID came to be the electric utility in our region. Dr. Paterson, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. For your second go-around on the TID Water and Power Podcast, you had previously joined us for episode 14 back in June of 2022, when we sat down to discuss TID's history and the formation of the district. But for some of our newer listeners, would you mind telling us a little bit about your background and some of your previous work with Turlock Irrigation District?
Well, I was raised on a farm in Houston. So we're engaged in farming. I was also a historical consultant working with district. I specialized in various kinds of water resource issues for the most part. I wrote the district's centennial history, which seems like a very long time ago now, which was the first 100 years of the district's history. And I'm privileged to continue some work with the district as a consultant in the years after that.
Wonderful. And in case anybody is interested in that first 100-year history of the district, the book is called Land, Water, and Power, A History of the Turlock Irrigation District. And we'll put information on that book in our show notes of the podcast. Okay, so last time we discussed the district's founding and the early years, including the beginning of irrigation. How would you describe the early years of the 20th century in our region?
Well, after the district began irrigation in 1900, new settlers actually flooded into the area. The old grain ranches, the extensive acreages of open land were turned into small farms. The learning curve for all this was very steep. TID had to learn to manage and improve a canal system on a shoestring budget, and the farmers, new to irrigation, had to learn how to use the water. Transition was extremely rapid. And it was, on the whole, successful. But it was not always easy.
Would you say there was a turning point when things kind of settled down or people kind of got in, I don't know if a routine is the right word, but they had a better understanding and a better idea of how to manage the irrigation system?
Yes, it happened somewhat gradually over time, of course. But things actually had to get worse in some ways before they could get better. The years 1913 and 1914 stand out in that regard as time of controversy, but they also set the course for what I would call a better future for TID.
Okay. Let's dive into that a little bit more. What sort of problems was the district facing in those years?
Well, of course, they had to continuously improve the canal system to keep pace with more and more irrigators. There's a growing demand for irrigation, but there were two really important issues or events at that time. Well, one of them was Hetch Hetchy, and the other one was a dam break.
Okay.
Now, in terms of Hetch Hetchy, San Francisco began planning a water project for the city to bring water from the Tuolumne in 1900. And the centerpiece of that project was going to be a dam at Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is in Yosemite National Park. It's a natural reservoir site, big valley with a narrow entrance where it was easy to build a dam. But it was also a very spectacular valley, sometimes compared to Yosemite. High granite walls, rock domes, waterfalls. Hetch Hetchy, because it was in a national park, to do anything there, the city needed a permit to enter the federal land. They needed it from the Secretary of the Interior, who had charge of the national parks. And they were twice turned down in their requests for a permit in the beginning. Now, TID and MID had the senior water rights on the river. And of course, they wanted to protect those water rights. Now, in 1907, a new Secretary of the Interior came on the scene. He held hearings heard what the irrigation districts had to say, heard what the city needed, and issued a permit with a number of conditions, which were intended to protect Hetch Hetchy Valley as long as possible and also to protect the irrigation district's prior rights to a certain amount of water, and the permit granted them some other benefits.
So for our listeners who might not be as familiar with the alignment of our system, TID and MID are the senior water rights holders, and we are located farther west on the Tuolumne River than where San Francisco was proposing to establish their system and their dam.
That's correct. The districts divert their water into the canals at LaGrange Dam. The city was thinking very high up on the watershed. Like I say, Hetch Hetchy is in the national park. Its tributary watershed are the highest reaches of the Tuolumne River.
So that would have had a huge impact on TID and MID.
Yes, anybody taking extra water from the river was going to potentially impact the district's water supply.
Okay. So then let's go back to the new secretary and the permit that was issued and the conditions and benefits that came along with that. Were the districts satisfied with that outcome?
I think generally they were. Their basic rights were protected, at least those rights as they understood them, at the turn of the century. And remember, they're just getting started irrigating. So the idea of how much water they need is, just developing.
Sure.
The problem is, what one Secretary of the Interior can grant to the city, another secretary can take away. And that's exactly what happened. There was a growing movement to protect Hetch Hetchy as a scenic resource. It was led by John Muir and the newly formed Sierra Club. And in 1910, the city was ordered to show cause why Hetch Hetchy Valley should not be removed from the permit entirely. And that would leave the city with only smaller and less valuable reservoir sites in the high country. To deal with that, the city hired an outside engineer named John R. Freeman. Now, Freeman was a noted water supply engineer. He had helped design the municipal systems for Boston and New York City. He had connections all over the East Coast and in Washington, D.C. Freeman issued a report in 1912 that absolutely changed everything. Instead of taking only 60 million gallons a day just for the city of San Francisco, which had been the original plan, Freeman proposed 400 million gallons a day to serve the entire Bay Area.
Wow.
And instead of a system of open canals and pipelines and some power plants as the water came down from the mountains, and then use all of that energy to pump the water over the Altamont Pass, Freeman came up with a plan for tunnels, pipelines, an entirely closed system that could deliver water to San Francisco by gravity, and in the process, generate immense amounts of hydroelectricity. Now, what all this meant was that the city wanted a lot more water than anybody had thought they wanted before. And that would restrict the water the districts would have available, because they always figured there'd be a big surplus from what they needed and San Francisco needed, and they could use that in the future. Now, all of a sudden, that was disappearing.
Right.
And so they decided to fight back. But by the summer of 1913, there was a bill working its way through Congress to eliminate the whole problem of Secretary of the Interior permits and grant the city what it wanted. And so a delegation from the districts went back to Washington with the idea of stopping it. They found out they were not going to stop it. So they negotiated additional concessions from the city. And then the districts dropped their opposition to the Raker bill. Now, one of the important things they got in those negotiations is access to more water during the spring snowmelt, which they could then use to store in reservoirs on the lower watershed if and when they built those reservoirs. Now, a few months later, opposition in the Senate raised hopes that Hetch Hetchy could still be defeated. And there was a public outcry in the districts to fight the Hetch Hetchy project and disown that deal that they'd made only a few months earlier. The MID board went along with that. TID stuck with the bargain. And there was a popular backlash in the district against them for doing that. The Raker Act passed in late 1913, but the fight continued to royal TID for some months. The chief engineer who had helped negotiate these changes, he supported them. He left, and there was a recall election to remove a director in the Houston area. But that failed. And after the recall failed, things quickly died down.
So obviously a lot of controversy and a lot of drama, for lack of a better word, with that situation. But then you also mentioned that there was a dam break in the midst of all this. What can you tell us about that?
Well, in the 1880s and 1890s, when the district and the canal system were being planned, the Tuolumne River looked like an almost inexhaustible water supply. And remember, nobody's doing any stream gauging. There wasn't any such thing as that until the late 1890s. So it just looked like a big river. But as more and more land was irrigated, it became clear there was just not enough water in the river once the snowmelt passed in the early summer. So you needed storage reservoirs. That was going to have to be the answer. TID and MID got together and cooperated on surveys of some potential dam sites on the upper watershed, some of the same places the city was looking, in fact. But the fastest and the cheapest alternative was to build reservoirs below LaGrange Dam along the canal systems on both irrigation districts. Modesto built what we call today Modesto Reservoir, and TID decided on a site on the Alfred Davis property where the canal went through a little valley and some small dams around it could create about a 48,000 acre-foot reservoir. Now, we call that reservoir Turlock Lake today. It's had a number of other names, but today it's Turlock Lake. So the work began about 1912 on building the reservoir, and it began storing water in the spring of 1914. And it was full, brim full, in June of 1914. In the early morning hours of June 27th, a section of the dam at the outlet gate broke.
Uh-oh.
The flood of water tore down through the main canal, ripped out it sloshed over the banks, tore out the embankment of the canal, and finally found its way back to the river and created a ravine in the river bluff leading down to Roberts Ferry. You can still see that ravine today as you drive the road up by Turlock Lake. It took until August to fix the main canal and get it back in operation. And by then, there was almost no water in the river. So the irrigation season essentially ended. Crops dried up. It was a bad time all the way around. People who were alive even in later years were asked, do you remember, some especially bad time? And a lot of them would name 1914, that Turlock Lake break, when their alfalfa dried up too soon. So that was serious. And to make matters worse, in the midst of the crisis, trying to get things rebuilt, the TID board of directors essentially stopped functioning for a time. One of the members, because after all, in the spring of 1914, everything looked just fine, was vacationing in Europe, visiting family. 3 of the directors were on their way up to see the work at the dam where they were repairing the canal by Turlock Lake when their car overturned en route. They were seriously injured. One of them died as a result of his injuries. Others were out of business for a while. The final director had already had something of a breakdown and was on his way out for health reasons. So there was nobody to run the district. Thankfully, the engineers were taking care of things. Even the director overseas had a hard time getting back because in the summer of 1914, World War I started and transatlantic traffic was affected.
Sure. They
did get everybody back together again finally. And I think that one of the important things for all of that stuff that happened, as bad as it was, and even an almost leaderless district for a bit, there was no public outcry. There was no agitation against the directors. There was nothing like there had been even in a few months before. And I think that showed that the district and the community of irrigators that it was serving had reached a kind of maturity. The pioneer days, the rougher days were ending.
Sure. They saw and appreciated the benefits of irrigation and were ready to move move forward.
And the district was operating internally better than it had been, even in the midst of these problems.
Sure. Okay, so Turlock Lake then was the first step in building reservoirs. At what point did the district begin planning for what would be Old Don Pedro?
It was known there were reservoir sites upstream from LaGrange Dam. By 1909, at least one power company and maybe more had been looking in that area.
And that was a private power company?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yes. They approached TID and MID, about, well, do you want to put together some kind of a project? Those discussions went on for years and years, but the districts were always adamant that they wanted full control of any future reservoir on the Tuolumne River. So essentially, the discussions went nowhere. Now, in the summer of 1913, TID sent engineer Roy V. Meikle and a survey party supplied by pack mules to a potential dam site near the old Gold Rush mining camp of Don Pedro Bar. Now, Meikle had come to TID the year before to help prepare the district's response to the Freeman Plan. And so he was an experienced engineer. They had him, so they sent him on this survey. From the surveys that Meikle did, Chief Engineer Burton Smith drew up plans for a 283-foot high dam and a reservoir that would hold 259,000 acre feet of water. That's like over 5 times the size of the Turlock Lake project they were building at that same time. So in December 1913, this is the same month that San Francisco got the green light to build Hetch Hetchy, the TID board adopted plans for Don Pedro and applied for federal land at the dam site.
So at this point, Turlock Lake was not yet completed. How did the district recognize the need for a larger reservoir?
Well, it was common knowledge that Turlock Lake would not be enough. It was quicker and cheaper to build, so you could get something sooner than you could wait and build a much more expensive, larger reservoir on the main river. But to get the kind of storage you needed for full development of the district, to get all the land under irrigation, you'd need a major reservoir, and you'd need it on the river itself. And that was Don Pedro.
Okay, so it seems like TID was kind of taking the initiative here in these larger reservoirs. When did Modesto get involved?
Well, the districts had worked together on the upper watershed surveys. And the agreement they made in 1890 to build the LaGrange Dam, the diversion dam on the river, that provided what was sometimes referred to as a future divisions clause, where if either district acquired water rights, rights in stored water, or projects above LaGrange Dam, the other would have the right to join in. And the costs and benefits of any upstream project were to be shared in proportion to the acreage in each district. So it was always clear MID would join the project at some point, but TID went ahead and took the lead. There was a brief controversy in 1918 as work was developing on the Don Pedro project, when an MID attorney who had a grudge against TID from their failure to repudiate the settlement on the Raker Act during those fascinating days in 1913, he tried to stir up opposition to joining TID in the Don Pedro project. He was promptly fired, and the two districts were working together again very soon. By the end of 1918, a consulting engineer had been hired, A.J. Wiley, who had built a big dam for the Federal Reclamation Service in Idaho. He prepared a design for the Don Pedro project. As the pace of work increased in 1919, the two districts signed a formal agreement for the construction of Don Pedro. And that set the division of the project at 68.46% to TID and 31.54% to MID. And that reflected the proportion of the total acreage in the two districts. And those percentages have governed all of the Tuolumne River projects the districts have undertaken ever since that time.
That's right. Still to this day. Okay. So Don Pedro Dam would have a power plant. That was part of the intention. Had TID shown any interest in electric generation before that time?
Yeah, it did. In 1910, Chief Engineer Burton Smith proposed building power plants at LaGrange Dam and at Hickman Drop, which a place where water poured over a drop right by the town of Hickman, mainly to power drainage pumps. And to step back a second, drainage is one of those things that doesn't get enough attention when we talk about irrigation, because it's absolutely essential, that you not let water stand at the root zone. And that's commonly a problem. And in TID, quickly developed a serious drainage problem because the new irrigators poured on so much water on their land, and land that was not fully and properly leveled. The water table rose dramatically in those early years of irrigation. There were even lakes on some of the low spots. There was one near Ceres that was covered almost 70 acres. So there was a big problem. Drain ditches could not go deep enough to solve the issue, and they were really hard to maintain if you did build them. Drainage pumping, you pump from the aquifer and get the water out and use it, push it somewhere else, would work, but the early gasoline engines that they tried just weren't reliable enough for that kind of steady, day in, day out operations. So you needed electric pumps, but there were no electric power lines and there were no electric supply in the area. So that was why TID's engineers first looked at the idea of building a power plant, was to power their drainage needs. Now, R.V. Meikle succeeded Burton Smith as chief engineer of TID in early 1914. Smith, you remember, was on the outs with people over his stance on Hetch Hetchy. And in 1916, Meikle drew up plans for a powerhouse at Hickman Drop again, and an oil-fired backup generator. But there was a vague reference in that proposal to furnishing power for other needs, but the main reason, again, was drainage pumps. But Don Pedro was already on the horizon by that time, and so nothing was done in 1916 about that either. Interestingly, in 1979, Hickman Drop became the site of TID's first mini hydropower plant. So we eventually got power there a long time later.
Right. So it almost, kind of too much of a good thing with irrigation and some of the early irrigators not knowing how to move water or about having too much water on their properties at that time spurred the need for the drainage pumping.
You needed drains, yes.
You had to power those somehow, thus the power from Old Don Pedro. So besides the drainage pumps, what did the districts plan to do with the power that Don Pedro could potentially generate?
Well, really, there's two options. They could wholesale the power to a private power company. That was the easiest. Provided immediate source of income to offset the cost of the dam. The other option was to go into the retail power business, as build transmission and distribution lines and sell directly to the people living in the district. Although TID kept its options open, it was kind of a consensus that had developed over time that they should do retail distribution. But it was not even clear then that an irrigation district had a legal right to become an electric utility.
Oh, interesting. So
to remedy that, the Tirlock and Modesto districts had Modesto Assemblywoman Esto Broughton introduce a bill in 1919 to allow irrigation districts to sell electric power any way they wanted. And when it passed, the districts were free to choose how to use the Don Pedro power.
So I think that, again, kind of emphasizes a specific characteristic about Turlock Irrigation District. You talked earlier about how the districts knew they wanted full control over any reservoirs that they built. Now we're getting into the power generation, and rather than wholesaling that to another organization, they wanted to kind of take that on themselves and sell directly to retail customers.
There was a great interest in it. The decision had not been made, but by doing the Broughton bill, they made sure they could make
it. They could do it.
It was legally possible to make that decision.
Okay, keeping that option open. And I don't want to get too far ahead of the story, so let's put a pin in that and we'll come back to it. But first, how did the districts go about building Don Pedro?
Well, the voters authorized bonds to pay for the project in 1919. And over the next year, detailed plans and specifications were drawn up. Construction companies were invited to bid on building the dam. But only 2 companies submitted offers in early 1921, and the directors rejected both of them because they were over the engineers' estimated costs. So that meant another round of discussions with potential construction companies. And what they got back were a bunch of cost-plus proposals. That is essentially, we build it, you take the risks, if we have cost overruns. And these became very popular in the World War I era. Inflation picked up at that time. People didn't want to commit to, fixed price contracts when things might get more expensive.
Sure.
So the districts tried to negotiate some kind of a deal with the contractors. They went quite a ways in discussions with one potential contractor. But those discussions just went on, dragging on, and the directors finally authorized their own engineers to begin to immediately build the railroad line that would be needed to haul construction materials to the dam site, sort of a preliminary step to get going on their own. And then in April 1921, with things still dragging, the districts decided to dispense with contractors altogether and ordered their engineers to begin at once to build the dam.
Oh, boy. Okay. Was that normal for the time for the irrigation district to take on such a monumental project?
As far as I know, it was unprecedented. These are rural water districts. They're just growing. No one expected them to have the ability to manage all the details of such a large construction project. But the districts just went ahead anyway. Meikle became chief engineer of the Don Pedro project, and a complete business staff was assembled in Turlock. It went about getting all of the bits and pieces that you need. There's a lot of nuts and bolts and cement mixers involved in building.
Both literally and figuratively.
Yes, there are. Yes.
Okay, so what can you tell us about the actual construction of the dam then?
It went really quickly. Hard to believe in these days, but it went very quickly. In the spring of 1921, work was underway on the railroad and on building a construction camp on the hills overlooking the dam site. Now, besides being outfitted with all the equipment needed for the project, the camp was a complete community. Bunkhouses for the single man, tents for families, a mess hall, a recreation center, a hospital.
Oh, my goodness.
With a number of beds. So work along the river was pushed to take advantage of the low water in the late summer and fall of 1921. And by December, the dam was 60 feet above the stream bed. The next year, work went so fast that the directors were forced to buy more railroad cars to keep enough sand and gravel moving into the cement mixers.
Wow.
And by the beginning of 1923, the dam was virtually complete. Work was going on the spillway that handled any overflow. Powerhouse machinery was in place at about the same time. So this dam went together very quickly, and it was a big project. It was a concrete gravity arch dam, 284 feet tall. It was 177 feet thick at its base and 1,000 feet long at the top. When it was finished, it was the highest dam in the world. It had a maximum capacity of 289,000 acre feet. And it filled for the first time on June 11th, 1923, and water went down the spillway. All this, that's just 2 years after the directors gave the order for their engineers to build the dam.
My goodness.
It was all done entirely by the districts on their own. There was a formal dedication held on June 25th, 1923. All the stores in Turlock closed for the day. A special train carried attendees. Somebody counted 375 cars in the parking lot by the dam. One of the people speaking at the ceremony that day was San Francisco city engineer M.M. O'Shaughnessy, who had just finished the Hetch Hetchy Dam.
Interesting.
So the Tuolumne now has 2 big dams.
Yeah, wow. Okay. All right. So going back to the question then of what to do with the power generated from Don Pedro, how was that issue finally settled?
Well, in the spring of 1922, with construction going on rapidly, PG&E made an offer to take the entire output and sell the district's power for drainage pumps, more or less at cost. Each district then hired an electrical engineer to evaluate the company's proposal. Now, TID's engineer was R.W. He thought the district could make more money in the long run by selling direct to consumers, and especially by offering low rates to encourage people to buy electric appliances. He emphasized lighting, cooking, and water heating in his report. But he acknowledged it would take a long time to build up enough use in the Turlock district to use TID's share of the Don Pedro output. So he recommended selling the surplus to power companies, but to do so as a guaranteed block of power, firm power, that would be worth much more than what PG&E was offering, because PG&E was basically offering to take, power generated by whatever's flowing through. It wouldn't be firm. TID directors did not take a position, but left it up to the voters at a special advisory election scheduled for June of 1922. In an interesting side development, MID's consultant took exactly the opposite position and endorsed the PG&E offer. And although the Modesto board scheduled their advisory election for the same day as TID, so everybody would be voting at the same time, the Modesto board went ahead anyway and decided they'd wholesale the power to PG&E even before the election.
Oh. But
the election happened quickly. To no one's surprise, distribution was overwhelmingly approved in TID. The vote was 2,433 for TID distribution and 116 against. That is a wild margin. MID voters also overwhelmingly favored distribution, and by the end of the year, they'd recalled the board members who went the other way.
Okay.
So everybody's back on the same page.
Yet again. Mm-hmm. All right. So what happened next?
Well, the district was suddenly in the electric business. It meant adding a main transmission line from Don Pedro to Turlock and substations and a network of distribution lines. You need to put together the people and the equipment needed to operate a reliable electric system. Again, that might have seemed like a really daunting task for an irrigation district, but hey, the district was already managing the construction of Don Pedro. It was something TID was prepared to do.
Just that innovative spirit continues.
Yeah, it went on. So the transmission line was completed to the Gear substation in February 1923. And after some delays in getting transformers, the power reached the substation on April 1st. A few weeks later, the first distribution line was running a drainage pump in Delhi.
My goodness.
And from there, things just took off like crazy. By August, it's only a few months, there were 400 retail customers, 600 in October. A little over a year later, at the end of 1924, there were 3,200 accounts, 250 miles of distribution lines. By 1930, there were 6,000 customers.
That's incredible growth.
It is an incredible growth.
So how were people of the area then using the district's electricity?
Well, lighting was first for most people. Electric lights were a huge improvement over flickering kerosene lamps. And as Shoemaker pointed out, the district needed to build up a retail load as quickly as possible. That meant promoting appliances like electric ranges, water heating, things like that. So to do that, TID put electric ranges in the hallway of their downtown office. And they had cooking demonstrations to show people how to use the ranges. And since there were no appliance stores, the TID sold ranges.
Oh, my goodness.
$20,000 worth by the time the power reached the substation.
Incredible.
In April 1923. Remember, there's actually no power, but people are putting their money down to get electric appliances.
Sure, the vision was there.
Demand was so great, the district opened its own retail store, selling ranges, refrigerators, washing machines, water heaters, space heaters, toasters, waffle irons, curling irons, whatever. All kinds of electric appliances, large and small, as well as motors, wires, and other electrical supplies for people who want to do it yourself. And they had servicemen to do installation and repair jobs. And besides appliances, which was, after all, one of the main consumer emphasis, electric pumps began to replace windmills in rural homes.
Okay. So it really just opened up a whole different quality of life, a whole different lifestyle for the people of the area.
In most parts of the country, there was not much change in rural life from the beginning of the 20th century well into the century. TID was hastening that. There were many areas of the country where electrification did not arrive until the 1930s and 1940s, with things like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Rural Electrification Administration. But in the San Joaquin Valley, electric power was more plentiful. And in TID, it happened fast in those years following 1923.
Wow. Very cool. Okay. So there was obviously this enthusiasm for electric living. But I think we mentioned earlier in our discussion that there were already private power companies serving the area.
Yeah, there were private companies, PG&E in Stanislaus County and the San Joaquin Light and Power Company in Merced County. But they mostly just served customers in towns. They didn't build rural lines because the cost per mile was so high relative to what they thought they could get. But TID wanted to serve rural customers. I mean, this is an irrigation district. They wanted to serve rural customers. That was a huge difference. And there's also a big difference in the cost of power. Private companies simply could not match TID's low rates. The number of customers they served dwindled rapidly. San Joaquin Light and Power sold its lines to TID in 1928, and PG&E did the same. That left the district in sole control of its service area.
Okay. So in the beginning, retail electric sales didn't use all the power that Don Pedro could produce. What did the districts do with the rest of it?
Well, that was the other part of Shoemaker's plan, to sell the extra power on the wholesale market. TID was able to make a deal with San Joaquin Light and Power in 1924 to take a guaranteed block of power for 15 years at a rate that reflected the reliability of that power supply. It was a very profitable contract for the district, and they had a right to renew it for another 15 years, which they did. And within just a few years, TID and MID had become so successful in their power business that they added 2 more generating units to double the capacity at Don Pedro, bringing it up to 30 megawatts.
Okay. Was TID then entirely dependent on Don Pedro, or were there any backup power supplies?
At first, it was just Don Pedro. And any power system needs some kind of backup to ensure reliability. Instead of building an oil or gas burning plant, TID built another hydro plant. This one was at LaGrange Dam, again, a site that had been frequently mentioned previously. It was fed by penstocks from the TID canal, where the canal comes out of the diversion tunnel at the dam. Now, it's only 4.3 megawatts compared to Don Pedro's 30, but you have to remember the retail load was still relatively small at that time. Now, water run through the Grange plant went back into the Tuolumne River, so it was lost to the canals. So you couldn't use the LaGrange plant very much during the irrigation season. But during the off-season, it used water released from generation at Don Pedro, and therefore put that water to a second use, which in turn allowed TID to keep more water behind the dam at Don Pedro. So it was a benefit all the way around. Now, to give you some idea of just how independent, or maybe we should say isolated, TID was in its early days, when the electrical system was just them, even something as simple as maintaining the standard 60 cycles per second frequency had to be done entirely by the operation of Don Pedro. And there was a master clock at the powerhouse that combined an electric clock and a pendulum movement. If everything was running the way it should, the single hand of the pendulum clock and the single hand of the electric clock were aligned. But if the generators were running a little too fast or a little too slow, then the electric clock would gain or lose time relative to the pendulum clock. And if that happened, the operators at the dam would slightly speed up or slow down the generators in the very early morning hours, and nobody would notice, and bring the clock back to the neutral position. And then all the electric clocks at TID would stay accurate.
Amazing.
By 1928, the districts were able to contract with San Joaquin Light and Power for standby service, so the district was no longer entirely dependent on Don Pedro and LaGrange. But in the early days, it was a very independent system.
Fascinating. Okay. All right. So Old Don Pedro effectively put TID in the power business. What other impacts did that project have?
Well, for TID itself, probably the most important one was a degree of financial stability that it never had before. It was always hand to mouth and continued to be hand to mouth until there were power revenues. I saw a letter from R.V. Meikle regarding the sale of some surplus equipment from the dam right before they had, all of the power business running. And he said in it, essentially, the Turlock Irrigation District is broke. Which for all they were doing,
wow,
there was construction money, but they didn't have a lot of operating funds. It was close. The electric business produced a steady income stream. And the basic policy was that retail power revenues would cover the cost of the electrical system. And then the funds from the wholesale power that they were getting, that was profit. And that could maintain a financial reserve. And you could cover unexpected expenses that way. You could lower property tax rates. And lowering the tax rate, the irrigation tax rate on all the property in the district was especially important during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And from an irrigation standpoint, though, Don Pedro was also a big game changer. Turlock Lake helped extend the irrigation season, but really it extended another irrigation and a half, something like that. The water usually ran out sometime in the summer. Don Pedro gave farmers a full irrigation season into the early fall. That led to an increase in irrigated acreage and better and more reliable crop yields. You could try different kinds of crops. Continued improvement in the canal system, like concrete lining, also improved service and shortened the interval between irrigations. Also contributing, of course, was the growing network of drainage pumps. The district, of course, had first looked at electric power because of the drainage problem. And as they built the pumps, they got the shallow groundwater table under control. The pumps did their job. More land was available for farmers. As an added benefit, of course, those pumps were an important source of water during droughts because they could push the water back into the canal system.
Mm-hmm. So what else did the district do around this time to help farmers improve irrigation?
Well, TID owns and operates only the main canals and laterals. The community and private ditches that take off from the canals and then go to each individual farm, those are the responsibility of the irrigators themselves. Maintaining dirt ditches is a terrible nuisance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to get everybody to cooperate to plow the ditch. Lining a ditch with concrete would solve that problem. It would save water. And it took up less land because the dirt ditches had very gentle slopes. So it would be a benefit, but everybody would have to cooperate on the ditch. And on some ditches, that was going to be a problem. So to solve this, TID sponsored a law in 1927 for the establishment of improvement districts within irrigation districts. It was kind of a mini right act in a way. A petition by at least 2/3 of the landowners on a particular ditch, naming a particular improvement, like lining, would be submitted to the district. If it was approved, all the land that was benefited was taxed and payment was stretched over 10 years. You didn't have to pay for it all up front. The TID board served as the trustee for each of its improvement districts. They did the engineering, arranged the financing, collected the taxes, took care of it all. It was an extremely popular program. Concrete lining was big at first. Later, poured in place concrete underground pipelines became popular. That's even better than an open ditch because you use even less land and it's more reliable. And the poured in place concrete system was actually a technique developed in the local area. All this really improved the delivery of water to farms.
So it helped farm owners kind of organize themselves into these smaller improvement districts, help them spread out the cost, which could have been prohibitive to lining some of these private ditches with concrete and whatnot, help them kind of spread that cost over a period of time and equally amongst the users in the improvement district.
Yeah. And TID did the heavy lifting.
Okay. Very good. With the success of Don Pedro and the electric system, did TID and our partners on the river, MID, provide a model for other irrigation districts to do something similar?
For the most part, no.
No.
Until recent times, the only other irrigation district that entered the retail power business was the Imperial Irrigation District, way down on the Colorado River in southeastern California. And in that case, Meikle and Shoemaker actually served as advisors to Imperial when they were planning their system. if you look at some of the nearby districts, Oakdale and South San Joaquin irrigation districts built the Malones Dam on the Stanislaus in the 1920s. Merced built Exchequer Dam on the Merced River at the same time. But in both cases, they had to wholesale the power to private companies to pay for the dams. Mm. So it looks like the Tuolumne River districts were just uniquely positioned to reap the benefits of the Right Act. The success of the conversion to irrigated agriculture in those districts, along with the district's size, the excellent water supply offered by the Tuolumne River, they just prospered as communities and as organizations. They had the capacity to take on a project like Don Pedro and to build the retail electric business. So it seems like it was an exceptional position. And that was emphasized and demonstrated during the Great Depression. Many, perhaps most, California irrigation districts were driven to bankruptcy or something close to it. They needed government loans to survive. That was true of the districts on the neighboring rivers. TID remained financially solvent and stable thanks to its electric revenues and the reserve funds that they'd built up. As farmers struggled to pay their irrigation taxes, TID reduced the taxes. Because it remained so solvent, the district was able to provide matching funds needed to get government grants for improvement projects across the district, and that put unemployed men to work. The 1930s were hard times, and many farmers did lose their farms, and a lot of people suffered. But TID, at least, was able to help its residents weather that storm.
So would you say there was some kind of capstone event that wraps up this part of the district's history?
Well, why not end with a party? The district celebrated its 50th birthday in 1937. The Depression was not yet entirely over, but the worst had begun to pass. And TID had accomplished so much in its first half century. From the struggle to build its canals, through the introduction of irrigation, the conversion of the worn-out wheat farms to irrigated agriculture, growing towns, Don Pedro, all that came from that. The pioneer days were only a couple of decades in the past, and the whole community remained very well aware of the importance of irrigation and of the irrigation district to its success. So for those reasons, the 50th anniversary was a really, really big deal. Mm. Now, when it came to that, we're celebrating this in June, which is the anniversary of the district's founding. The Irrigation Districts Association held a meeting in Turlock on June 11, 1937. That was a weekend. Included an address by the governor. And meanwhile, downtown Turlock had vaudeville shows and a big street dance.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, the next day, 20,000 people watched a parade through downtown Turlock that included floats by various TID departments, old and new TID equipment, marching bands, horses, more floats from community organizations. It was apparently a very long parade.
Quite a spectacle.
The grand finale of the day was a pageant staged at the Turlock High School football field. There was played out in front of a backdrop that was 150 feet long, 60 feet high, and had a massive painting of Don Pedro. Hundreds of high school students from all over the district portrayed episodes from the region's history. At the end of the performance, a line of silver fireworks was ignited along the backdrop to give the impression of water coming down the Don Pedro spillway. And then more fireworks lit the sky. That seems like a pretty good way to wrap up the first 50 years or so of the Turlock Irrigation District's history.
I'll say, my goodness, thank you for that trip through history and the vivid description of what that Jubilee must have looked like and how excited everyone, and as you mentioned, appreciative everyone was of irrigation and power in the area. Dr. Paterson, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.